So if you can have everyone return back to their seats, we're going to get started with the rest of our day and follow a similar structure and process to yesterday with bringing some virtual people on to share some knowledge with us. And before we do that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Abadesco.
Good morning and welcome again for this great day that we're going to have today. We have with us on video, and I've been given the pleasant task of introducing one of the pioneering women in the practice of organization development. Barbara Bunker is an organizational social psychologist and professor of psychology emerita at the University of Buffalo. Her practice in OD spanned over 40 years. She has worked with major businesses, government, voluntary, educational, and professional organizations. She taught in leadership and OD programs at American, Pepperdine, and Harvard universities. She has authored several books on conflict management and large group methods. Barbara both practices and teaches at the academe, which is a great combination of both academic as well as actual practice in organization development. Barbara will share with us her perspective over her long span of career and practice of organization development, specifically on OD and large group methods. Barbara, my pleasure. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. Rick is going to help me to manage this interaction with you. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, okay.
Good.
Great.
We're going to start by talking a little more about the history of OD. And I'd like to start by just talking about my experience in Japan when I was teaching there in the 80s. A lot of the early OD, and I'll talk a bit about it in a few minutes, is about small group methods. How do we work with groups? How do we help them improve their functioning, et cetera, et cetera. And most of this research was developed in the West, in Europe and in the United States. And it is the basis for OD practice. I will talk in a few minutes a little bit more about the history, because I know Ed Shine spent some time talking with you about sociotech yesterday, but he may not have talked about some of the other parts of the early history. So, what happened to me was I was teaching in Keio, in Tokyo at the Keio Business School, and I was teaching a course on group process and group dynamics. And just before I started to teach, I suddenly became aware that all of this data, all of these ideas developed in the West. And I had at that point no idea whether any of them applied to groups in Japan or not. So what I did was I walked into the classroom and I said to the students, okay, I am going to teach you everything I knew about small group processes and about meetings and about how you improved group functioning. And you are going to tell me at the end of each class whether you think any of this will work in Japan. Okay, so I think that I would like to use that story as a starter for saying that many of the things that I'm going to talk about are things that are part of OD practice, But I think one of the really interesting things now is to talk about what part of this is relevant to Indonesia, what is relevant to China, what is relevant to India. How do we adjust some of this early practice to the Asian context, basically? So let me just start by giving a little history. After the Second World War, Kurt Lewin, who was the father of social psychology, fled Germany, or before the Second World War, he fled Germany and he came to America. And he partnered at the University of Michigan and then MIT with a number of people who were early in the OD practice. And what they were interested in was, they were interested in leadership. How can we lead in a different kind of way? And part of this was a reaction to the totalitarian leadership of Hitler and what happened in Germany. So there was great sensitivity to people being authoritarian and not being very democratic. And he did very interesting experiments, collected data on what are groups like when they're led by democratic leaders or authoritarian leaders. And that was the beginning of what is a whole discipline in the university now, which is called social psychology. And the early part of social psychology was small groups to understand group dynamics and meetings and things like that. So what's my history, which has been a lot of fun for me, was when I got to graduate school, I realized that as an undergraduate, I was taught by a man named Hubert Bonner. And Hubert Bonner wrote the first textbook in social psychology in the United States. That is, there was no social psychology until about the late 1940s. And so I feel like I have been there ever since it started, practically. And that has been a lot of fun for me. So what's happened in the study, people in the university what have they studied about groups? They've studied roles, they've studied group development, they've studied leadership, they've studied meetings, all kinds of things. And if you want to improve how groups are working, you can use this knowledge. And there are kind of two streams here. The researchers produce a lot of knowledge, but the practitioners, who are the people who ended up being in OD, trained by national training labs in some places like that, the practitioners are the ones who use the knowledge to improve groups. So how do you do this? Well, I'd like to just take a look at the slides that we have. Are there slides up now? Could we put the slide up that is called Levels of Intervention?
Oh, so move forward, yep.
Okay, so if you look at this, this slide, you'll notice that at the bottom, there are individuals. So here we are. We all, in all organizations, we're dealing with individuals. But it's always the case that individuals interact with each other. And they do that in order to make things happen in the organization. So we have interpersonal relations. And then in order to make things happen even more effectively, we have groups of people who have subgroups who form the organization. And those groups have to get along with other groups. So we have intergroup kinds of issues in organizations. And as a result, when you draw a big circle around all of this, what you have is a system in which you have individuals and interacting with each other in groups, and groups interacting with each other, and then you have the whole system. And OD has what we call interventions. It's kind of a fancy word, but what it means is we think we know something about how to improve what is going on at each of these levels. And one of the things an OD person does is to make some choices with whoever they're working with about at what level are we going to work. So these days, I think, there's a lot of work at the system level. But previously, there was a lot more work at the group level. When I was trained in the 60s, we had a lot of group development, and we had a lot of team building, and we had a lot of work at the interpersonal level. We knew a lot about kind of how to help people at those levels. We talked a lot about systems, but we didn't have many real strategies for dealing with systems. So now I'd like to show you the OD chart, which is more than we can really talk about here. And is that up on the board now? And do people have copies of this OD chart?
Yes, they have copies. And we're going to see
Okay.
it on the screen in just a second.
Okay. Well, if you look at the copies of the OD chart, these funny little figures are on this chart because my colleague Billy Allman and I, her granddaughter, drew these figures for us. But what this chart does, I just want to, I'm going to talk very generally about it, but this is kind of a summary of some of what we call interventions or ways that OD folks work in organizations. Across the top is a kind of timeline of what was going on in the world, beginning with World War II and going on toward the present. And across the bottom is a list of some of the organizations that were early adapters, people who jumped right in and started using OD right away, basically. But from our point of view here, in this conversation, the important thing to notice is that we always, the ways that we work are represented by the four middle lines. Some of the earliest work was in survey research. That is, OD has always felt very strongly that we are data-based. So we ask people, we collect information. We don't just decide things. We work with people to know how they are thinking before we move ahead into to make changes. So we use a lot of surveys, we use data feedback, and we use interpersonal feedback if we're working at that level. Then the groups that I was just talking about, the National Training Labs developed something called sensitivity training, but it's really group dynamics training. And so there are a number, as you walk across that whole line there, you'll see team building, which was something that was very strong in the 70s and 80s. And then there were intergroup workshops where you bring two parts of the organization together to talk to each other. And Ed Schein, who you talked with last night, is very strong in the whole area of process consultation. That is, he helped people to understand how they were doing their work. And then we began to be aware of the fact that we needed to not just talk in one way, but we needed to understand the diversity of the people who worked in the organization, et cetera, et cetera. So as you go across here, you find all kinds of different interventions that have happened up to the present time, where one of the interests is, how do you work with virtual teams? And finally, there is the system. And I think one of the things that I bring that is kind of fun is that ever since the beginning of OD, we always talked about systems. But the truth is we never had really any good interventions that really worked with the whole system until the large group interventions, which is happened over in the 90s and the 2000s, basically. So mostly we were struggling to work with the system, but we didn't really have methods. And in my second part of my talk, I will talk more about those methods, and because I think they are the things that are most popular today and that a great many OD people are using. So this is just some of the kinds of things that OD people have been involved in. But it seemed to me and to the planners of this conference that it might be quite useful to do a quick history. Probably not enough, but enough is enough here, of what is happening, what has happened to get us to the present state. So Rick, I'm going to ask you to get people talking to each other about the topic that we're moving into here, what they would like to talk more about with me.
Okay, in your table groups, I'd like you to kind of just discuss your reactions to the first segment of Barbara's presentation. Comments, your own perspectives or questions in your table groups. So we'll do that first in the table groups. I'll give you a few minutes and then we will ask you to actually ask your questions or share your perspectives. So we're giving the table groups some time to discuss and share their reactions before they shoot out their questions or comments. Small groups, just share your thoughts, reactions, questions. In a couple of minutes, we will have a chance to interact with Barbara, share your perspectives, reactions, questions, and get her response. Okay, Barbara, we you have access to the questions, reactions from the groups. And we'd like to just pick up maybe 3 items, 3 questions, and get your reactions and comments. The first one is kindly give an example of a large group intervention in terms of OD.
Yes. I will be telling the story in the second part of this talk of a school of education at the University of Southern California that the administration of the university felt was not doing its job. It was failing. And the question was, should they just close the school, or could the school reinvent itself for the modern age? And we used a large group intervention. The faculty and the students together created a new vision of what the school should be doing, and they implemented it. And they did this in a participative way with using something called future search. That would be an example of a large group intervention in an organizational setting. And I'll talk in more detail about those in the second part of my talk, or the third part of my talk.
Okay, thank you. Second question is, kindly discuss the process of individual to system level analysis.
Yeah, one of the very interesting things for a practitioner is figuring out what level do we focus on. It's often the case that the client, the person who comes to you, will tell you, we have a big problem with the VP of finance or something like that. And sometimes it is the person that's the problem, but just as often, it's something going on in the system at the, for example, between two groups or something like that, which is the problem. So the OD person's role is to help people diagnose or understand fully what the real problem is, so that you're not trying to fix a person if the process is, if the real problem is that the way the system is organized, that's what happens to this person. I hope I'm being clear about this, but this is a very important part of the OD practitioner's role, is to help the system figure out what should be, what the real problem is, rather than the symptom, which is what often is what gets talked about. Rick?
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. Any other
Another
questions?
question?
Oh, here's one. What is the future trend of OD interventions? But I understand you'll probably talk about this in this coming segment.
Yeah, I think the quick answer is we're working more and more at the system level, because organizations are dealing with the global kinds of changes that they have to deal with. And so although there are still group problems and there are interpersonal problems, most organizations are focused on how are we going to interact in the world that we're interacting in.
Thank you. And yes,
Barbara, this is Roland Livingston.
Hi, Roland Livingston.
How are you?
I'm good.
Great. I want to ask you to talk a little bit about use of self and how the OD practitioner has to pay attention to what's going on in him or her as they engage with a system.
Well, the tradition in OD has been for the practitioner to know something about themselves and to have done enough work on themselves that they, in fact, engage or learn to work with other people rather than intruding themselves in that setting. So the use of self is a very important part of the practice of OD. I would be very interested, although as you go through this conference, to hear a discussion of what would that mean in Asia? How does that work in Asia? I can talk about it from the point of view of a Westerner, but I think that as we translate these methods and pick up methods and use them in other cultures, we have to be very careful that we don't just make assumptions that, we just go in and do it the way it's done in the West. I think that's not a good idea. So I think that's a really good question, but hopefully you and the delegates will have more time with each other to talk more about it.
okay. I'd like to suggest we move on to the next segment, Barbara.
Okay. So let's do the slides on gender and OD. This segment is going to be rather personal, and I'm hoping that you will just listen to my story, and then you will have a chance to talk with each other about what your own experience has been. I'm going to talk simply about my experience. So can we have the first slide, the one that says the world in 1965?
Yes.
Is it up there?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so here's Barbara Bunker, fresh out of early graduate school, not the graduate school that's in organizational, but another graduate school. And I took a job at Duke University, and in student activities, I was in charge of student leadership training. I was in charge of, when I got to Duke University to do this work, all they were doing in leadership training was Robert's Rules of Order, which is how the US Congress works, but it is not group dynamics. It's very structured. So I was trying to figure out what to do. And was sent to a T group as part of my training. And the T group stands for Sensitivity Training Group, and it is about group dynamics. It's the thing that was invented at the National Training Labs. And so I discovered that there are all these things that I just talked about in terms of groups that you can learn about. And I took some of that, I got trained, and I took some of that back to the campus and started a whole different program in terms of leadership training. And as a result of all that, I decided to go to graduate school, and I ended up at Columbia University. And I was just extremely lucky in my choice, because I got very well trained theoretically by a man named Morton Deutsch, who was a student of Kurt Lewin, and whose major area was conflict resolution. But at the same time, in the same department, was Matthew Miles. And Matt Miles was doing the earliest OD interventions. He was working with schools. And we were research observers, and we were able to watch some of the earliest organizational change interventions, where they collected all kinds of data from teachers and students and parents and faculty about what they felt was going on in the schools, and then they focused on the areas where people felt improvement was important, and got all of the levels of the organization participating in figuring out what improvements were really important and how to get them to happen. So that was my early experience at getting trained. It's important to understand, in terms of the history of OD, that the earliest OD folks were university-based. They were faculty. They weren't practitioners. And they were also all mostly white men. And it was kind of NTL, which was the institution that trained people in these skills. There were not many women in graduate school, and there were not many women being trained at NTL. So let's do the second slide, which says my story on the top. So the way that you got to do this kind of work, to become a practitioner, which I was very interested in because of my Duke history, was you had to get admitted to the internship training program up at Bethel, Maine, which was run by NTL Institute. It was 9 weeks long. And they only took about 20 people a year. And they didn't take many women at all. I went in 1968, there were 3 women in my class, the rest of the 20 people were men. And so it would be fair to say, I think, that the group dynamics, the early OD establishment was pretty much a white male club. And NTL was certainly that. And we, Edie Seashore and I, Edie was around from the early 50s. Edie Seashore and I, and Billy Albin, who is my colleague and collaborator, we tried to change the system a little bit, and we had very interesting experiences. I'm going to tell you about a couple of them. One experience we had was, this is typical of what the experience that women had at that time. So we're in a staff planning. We're planning for a group of people that are coming in to be trained. And so we're planning the schedule. And we have worked out the design for the morning, and we know everybody's going to have lunch, and then the question is, what shall we do after lunch? So I said to this group of 7 or 8 people, of whom there were 2 women and about 6 or 7 men, I said, gee, I think that after lunch, people tend to get sort of sleepy and logy. Maybe it'd be a good idea to have some kind of activity after lunch, not a lecture, not another talk. And what happened next was somebody else made a different suggestion, and somebody else made a different suggestion. And I was sitting there wondering, maybe I didn't say that right. Maybe I wasn't very clear about what I was saying. So maybe 10 minutes later, another person in the room, Bill, said, well, he said, after lunch, you know, I think people tend to get a little sleepy, maybe a little logy. He said, I think that what we need is some kind of activity. Oh, said another guy, that's a great idea. Let's talk about that. And the whole group talked about it, and they adapted an activity. And I sat there wondering why what I had said wasn't discussed. So after the meeting was over, I took Edie Seashore aside. I said, Edie, did I say something? Was I not clear? You know, Bill said exactly what I'd said 10 minutes earlier, and nobody, I mean, it was like like nothing happened. Edie laughed and she said, Barbara, she said, they don't expect women to have good ideas. So the business of not being heard because you're female was something that we all struggled with early on. And Edie and I and many other women made a deal. We made a deal with each other, and that was, we said to each other, if you propose an idea, whether I like it or not, I will follow up. If nobody picks it up, I will follow up and say, hey, Edie just suggested this, and I think that's interesting. I think we ought to talk about it. That's all it takes to get ideas talked about, rather than dropped. But that was the atmosphere in which we were trying to make ourselves felt as part of that organization. And in 1975, 4 of us were asked to come into NTL because NTL was in trouble. And what happened there was very interesting, and that is we discovered how badly, but NTL was really in debt, very deeply in debt. And what happened was that the 4 of us discovered how bad it was, and we decided that we would see what we could do about saving the organization. And so what we did was we went to colleagues and we talked with them about helping us to change NTL. And we got them to agree to work free for 2 weeks, 75 people, which was enough money in terms of income to pay off the debt. And then we went to the board of directors and we said, and this was an astonishing experience, we said to the board of directors, okay, if you will resign and give us the board, we will pay off the debt. And the board, which was a group of business people who were about to close the organization, they were going to declare bankruptcy and just close the organization. They were very relieved to have somebody save them. So they said, yes, we'll do that. And so the 4 of us took over NTL and we changed it to be a much more inclusive organization that was interested in recruiting and training women, people of color, people of all nationalities, not just white men. And so that, for me, that was a very, very important experience. And that theme has run through a lot of what NTL has done over the years. And it expanded from gender to diversity to sexual preference, et cetera, as we all know. So it's been really a wonderful kind of history. So I think that the thing that we might want to talk about is what's happened in the OD in the United States is now there are almost more, I think there are more women as OD practitioners than there are men. So there have been huge changes over the years. in terms of who is doing OD and what their practice is like. But I think that we have a question for you all to talk about it in terms of my story. That's my story. What's your story? So, Rick, let's get that question up on the board so people can talk about it.
Thank you, Barbara. At this point, I would like to suggest that in your table groups, you discuss the question, what's happening in your own organization when it comes to women and the participation, empowerment of women in your respective organizations. We'll give you 5-7 minutes and then we'll open the floor. So on the screen are some of the questions that you have posted, and Barbara is able to read these questions. But I think there are some questions on the floor. We'll take them first. Eric? Yes, please come closer to the mic.
Good morning, Dr. Barbara Bunker. Thank
Good
you very
morning.
much for your sharing with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I am the owner of a 30-year-old consulting firm from Mexico down to Argentina during the last 30 years. And I have a question that has to do with gender. About a year and a half ago, I said I have to take a look at myself. And I learned that although women do not have that much participation in organizations as men have, especially as top executives, 75% of my proposals accepted were with women. That is, as a client. So and on the other hand, I would say that almost all of the projects where women participation was present was much more efficient and effective and healthy for the organization than those where men participated. So I came to the conclusion that men do not take risk. They used to go to Pete Marwick Mitchell to Press Waterhouse at the Young for consulting, more than choosing my firm, because of course if anything went wrong, they'd made the right decision. But women, they took risks, and we achieved the best results in these projects. I would like to learn from you too, Dr. Barbara Bunker, about it.
Well, I think thank you very much. That's just a wonderful comment. I think one of the things that we need to know, one of the reasons we need women to be more active is because they bring a different thing to the party. They bring different skills and different sensitivities. And so when women are really equal partners, you can have a lot of fun because men bring their background and skills and women bring their background and skills, and you get a better organization. But when you have only one, all women's organizations have problems. All men's organizations have problems. It really helps to have both. And we don't have enough of that in the world, I think, where men and women are on equal footing with each other. So thank you for your comment, very, very much. Yeah.
Great. All right, so just wanted to make a process observation. Barbara is a very important woman in the field of organization development, and she was way ahead of her time. She was with all white men, and she was the only woman in the room many times. And so we want to talk about gender today. We want to talk about the role of women today in organizations. And I was laughing to myself because we had all men up here deciding which questions to ask Barbara. And so I wanted to invite some women to come up to the front to personally ask Barbara some questions. Who wants to be the first brave woman? Come up here so Barbara can see you.
Hello, Dr. Barbara. Thank you very much for your
Hi there.
wisdom. And my name is Stella. And what I understand is that it's my understanding is that woman and man is just like creating partnership. Okay, so man
Yes.
has different quality, woman has different quality in every way, in family or in organizations. We just need to create partnership. So my question to you is, as a woman, even in the family or my company or everywhere, how can we as an OT practitioner, educate men or women, like empowering women or educating men so that we can create partnership in everywhere?
Well, I'm not sure what is appropriate in your culture, but what happened in my culture was that women got together and they started educating the men that were susceptible to being educated, okay? We started with people we thought would be open to this, and this was very surprising. I'll tell you a quick story. I have men in my culture are used to doing all the talking. So I had a colleague who went to work with a consulting firm that was doing some diversity training. And I met him, not someone who lives in my town, so I was eager to see him, and we had dinner together. And it was a delightful dinner. And I said, Stephen, I just really enjoyed this. Thank you very much, as we finished the dinner. And he said, Barbara, do you know what's been going on here? And I said, Stephen, I have no idea. And he said, Barbara, I have kept you talking for 3 hours. Meaning that he didn't do all the talking. He asked me questions. He drew me out. He got me going. And I was totally unaware of this, but he was practicing this as a man because he was used to moving in and talking. And if the women didn't talk, he just assumed they didn't have any ideas. And so he was developing the skills as a man of drawing out somebody who is less talkative. We have that same kind of issue between extroverts and introverts. The extroverts are always talking because that's how they figure out what they're thinking. The introverts often are quiet and don't say the good stuff that they're thinking. So the extroverts need to develop the skill of finding out what's going on in the room rather than taking up all of the time for talking. So I think your comments are really very interesting. There's a lot of interesting work that can be done here between men and women as we appreciate each other's skills.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for
Thank
asking
you very
that
much.
question.
All right, so men, ask questions, right? Is that the learning? Ask your female employees and peers and leaders what they're thinking and bring out that wisdom. Who else would like to ask a question, a woman or a man?
Hi, Barbara.
Hi there.
Very nice to see you in person. I have your book at home. I bought it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Large
A large
scale.
group book?
I have your book, Large Scale Intervention.
Oh, yeah. Does it look like this?
The other way. Upside down. Yeah, that's right. That's the one. Yes. Thank you.
Good. Yes.
Barbara, I'm part of some writers. Is it like this? I'm part of some writers who published a book by Palgrave Macmillan titled Current Perspective on Asian Women in Leadership. And I wrote a book chapter about Indonesian women in leadership. From my analysis, historical and cultural analysis, I I see that the key factor that enable women to identify herself as a leader is their father. So identity as a leader is growing, is developing, first of all, in family. It is very hard to bring it up, or it's harder to bring it up in an organizational life if, when they are in family, they do not grow that. So my thesis is, I don't know, perhaps for Asian people, that we ask fathers to develop their daughters, fathers to believe in their daughters, yeah, so that their daughters can develop this identity as a leader. And we as a society can be benefit from that. What do you take on that?
I think that's a wonderful comment and a very good idea. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Anyone else? Ula, please come up to the front.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Ula.
Good morning or good evening. I really have one question closer. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
So in Germany, we are talking about a quotation for women in the top management level and also in the advisory boards. And there is also a lot of discussion amongst women, and many of them are against this because they say we want to step up on the career ladder by our own capabilities and show our strength and are good in competition. But I think it is important to get an entrance in these hierarchies, and whatever helps is good. What do you think?
I think that, at least in the United States, and possibly you can speak better for European countries, I think that, number one, we are making very slow progress of getting women on boards and women in high executive levels. And one of the reasons for that is the laws in the United States about childcare and about maternity leave and about vacations and things like that. In Europe, those laws are much better, but I think the stress for many women who have children, and there are many women who do have children who are working, is that it is very difficult to do what is expected of an executive these days in terms of time commitment and being available 24/7 and things like that, and carry that role. And so in the US, what's happening is some very talented women who would be very able to get those kinds of jobs are deciding it's not worth it because there's not the support system out there that allows me to have everything that I need to have. I'm not willing to sacrifice my kids in order to be an executive vice president. It's not true of everybody. And when people make enough money, they can do child care and that, pay for child care and that sort of thing. But it's a very much more complicated system for many women. It's also the case that some men in the United States are taking on some of the family roles in order to allow women to do some of these things if that's what they want to. But that's also a slow process. It's not happening in every family. So I think that is really a major issue. We need more women at the top because to change the culture of a lot of organizations, we need women interacting in the executive suite with men in the executive suite to make the culture the kind of culture that women can productively be part of. So it's a slow process, but those are my first thoughts in answer to your thoughts. What do you think, Ula?
I think we have a similar situation in Germany that we found out after the team leader level. You do not find chances for part-time employment. So if women have to care for children, they often have to choose, do I have a career or do I have children or have a family? And
Yeah, it's not a choice that women should have to make.
so
They ought to be able to do both if that's what they want to do. Yeah.
and
Yeah. Thank you, Ula. Yeah.
yeah, thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Ula. Thank you, Barbara. At this point, we'd like to take a 15-minute break, and we'll invite Barbara again for the second segment of her talk.
I just have a couple of announcements before we head out. First is around connecting to each other and building community. And so that's something that's foundational in the field of organization development, is to build relationships. So we encourage you to meet with 3 people, new people over the break, and get to know them, where they work, and just meet someone new. The other thing that I'd like to announce is the BNUS University is offering 1 scholarship. That's a big deal. 1 scholarship for a potential student. And the deadline to submit for that is going to be at noon. So over the break, if you could please fill out the register, there's a form in your welcome packet, and return it to the BNUS booth. Worth 160 million rupiah. Yeah, that's an awesome, awesome opportunity. Lastly, as we evolve into the future, you have all heard of Twitter, right? Twitter? Tweeting? Millennials out there? We'd like to create a hashtag, AODN 2017. So if you hear something interesting and you want to tweet about it, make sure you hashtag AODN 2017. Okay? Great. See you in 15 minutes.